Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. If you are listening to this at home on Saturday night, you either missed the Edinburgh UFO conference or you're listening on the archives. The UFO conference in Edinburgh is the number 3 UFO get-together in the world. Since I recorded this before driving to Edinburgh, I hope I was there. If you saw me, say hi. That won't work. Hopefully next week I'll give you a rundown on who was there and what they had to say. I must be making some assumptions here. I'm assuming I made it down there and back. If I'm still on the podcast next week, I made it back okay. What's the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth? About 6 months. I got that from Russell Brand. John Howard sent me a link about the White Death, and after reading it, I had to do a show. World War II was a long time ago. Some folks today consider it ancient history. What they fail to realize is that war did more to change the entire planet than just about any other event. Countries discovered who their real allies were. People discovered what real heroes looked like and what cowards could do to stay alive. New technology was invented that pointed our world in a new direction. The United States became a world power, but we lost a lot of our freedoms. No one noticed it at first. It was a slow mission creep that went from protecting our country from foreign powers to keeping an eye on we the people. A lot of people stayed in the rear with the gear, yet somehow managed to receive medals and piles of cash for their heroic actions. Some people have a skewed idea of what a hero is. If the word play is anywhere in your job description, you're not a hero. Sports folks are great at what they do, but they don't reach the same level as those who risk their lives for their fellow man. In 1938, most of the world was content, thinking everything was mostly okay. The U.S., as well as a lot of other countries of the world, were just coming out of the Great Depression, and it looked like the future was bright. One of my favorite songs is called Laughing into 1939 by Al Stewart. Germany was gearing up for war, yet the politicians all chose to ignore the signs, announcing peace in our time. Adolf knew fighting a two-front war was a bad idea. He'd seen how the Great War, soon to be known as World War I, was too much of a strain on the German military and its people. He wanted to keep Russia out of the war by any means possible. On August 23, 1939, just days before the first acts of war broke out in Europe, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union surprised the world by signing the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, in which the two countries agreed to take no military action against each other for the next 10 years. Joseph Stalin liked this pause in fighting, giving him time to build up the Soviet military. German Chancellor Adolf Hitler used the pact to make sure Germany was able to invade Poland unopposed. The pact also contained a secret agreement in which the Soviets and Germans agreed on how they were going to divvy up Eastern Europe. The world looked at this pact as being just a treaty and not a future plan for parts of Europe. Peace in our time, they kept chanting. Nazi Germany's war with Poland began on September 1st. It was an uneven contest. 5 German armies with 1.5 million men, 2,000 tanks, and 1,900 modern aircraft faced fewer than 1 million Polish troops with less than 500 aircraft and a very small number of armored vehicles. In addition, German planning and technology, the support and German understanding of the importance of modern tactical air power gave the aggressor great advantages. Adolf told the world his troops were acting in self-defense, claiming that Polish troops had attacked them first. Britain and France had signed agreements stating they would come to the aid of Poland should any country attack them. As German troops marched from one side of Poland to the other, Britain and France both shook their sabers and made rude noises. Lots of speeches were made declaring war on Germany, but nothing much was done. Stalin was watching what Adolf was doing. He decided this was his chance to negotiate with Finland over much disputed territory just a few miles from Leningrad. Stalin also wanted a coastline so he could build military ports. He claimed he would be willing to trade a huge chunk of land in Soviet Karelia, amounting to twice the territory demanded of Finland. In other words, the Soviets promised to give Finland more land than they were taking away. The Finns knew that if they ceded any territory to their former imperial masters, their independence would be over. Stalin would take what he wanted and never give any land back. The Soviet demands gave way to threats, and when the talks faltered, Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister and henchman, announced, "Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, maybe it's the soldiers' turn to speak." November 30th, 1939, the big guns roared and Soviet bombers screamed overhead as the Red Army invaded Finland. What Finns called the Talvisoto, or Talvisota, the Winter War had begun. The governments of the rest of the world sat on their hands and watched as one war after another broke out, but they refused to do anything. "Peace in our time," they mumbled. The Soviet army had been confident of a rapid, decisive victory. Only 2 months earlier, German panzer columns had sliced through Polish defenders in multiple sectors, linking up far behind the lines and encircling virtually all of the million-man Polish army. The Poles had fought bravely, even heroically, but they were outclassed. They had been forced to attack armor divisions with cavalry units. When you're down to your last few bullets, you do what you can. Stalin, Molotov, and the Soviet commanders on the Finnish front were anticipating a similar success. What they got was something very different. Despite massive Soviet numerical and material superiority on the ground and even greater in the air, the round-the-clock bombing of Helsinki and other targets that inflicted heavy civilian casualties, the first month of this conflict, the Russian army came to a grinding halt. The Red Army got nowhere and began suffering massive casualties in doing so. Am I the only one seeing a repeat of history here lately? Kind of like something going on in Eastern Europe right now? I should take just a moment here to thank my listeners in both Russia and the Ukraine for listening in while trying to stay alive. I hope the people involved come out okay. To heck with the governments. Some of this failure can be laid in Stalin's lap. He was doing the same things Adolf did towards the latter part of the war, micromanaging his troops. Stalin also had screwed up his military in the worst way possible. As a reaction to the darkening international situation, he had spent 2 years enlarging the Soviet military. Between 1937 and 1939, the Red Army grew from 1,500,000 men to 3 million, and it would continue to grow to 5 million by 1941. At the time, Stalin had purged the army's leadership. 80% of the corps and divisional commanders accused of disloyalty had been imprisoned or shot. Of all the generals and colonels in the Soviet military, so many had been killed or imprisoned, there was nobody left to yell attack. The guys still in position of semi-authority were too scared to say anything. They sat and waited for orders to come from Joe before doing anything. The combination left masses of poorly trained soldiers serving under officers who were political hacks or scared to death of exercising initiative for fear of falling afoul of Stalin and the secret police. It is said, it is better to have an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by a sheep. Commanding the Finnish army was Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim. He was a multilingual descendant of Swedish nobility who had settled in Finland in the late 1700s. Mannerheim never became particularly adept at speaking Finnish. He'd been born a subject of the Tsar and entered the Russian army and rose to the rank of lieutenant general. Most nobility and those who wanted to be like them didn't speak much Russian. They spoke French. It was considered the thing back then. Only the peasants spoke nothing but Russian. I read War and Peace one time. I'll never read it again. Too long and too much peace, with just enough war to keep you from throwing the book away. The Tsar's February 1917 overthrow and the October's Bolshevik Revolution led the Grand Duchy of Finland to declare independence. And now it's time for a rant. It was not a Russian revolution, as most folks will claim. A revolution is the fundamental and relative sudden change in political power and political organization which occurs when the population revolts against the government. This is not what happened in 1917. A bunch of international banks sent suitcases full of money into Russia to get Tsar Nicholas II out of power. The Russian Navy was used to fight the few military personnel who still supported the Tsar. Most people living in Russia had nothing to do with the overthrow. It was a military coup. The name White Army is associated with the white symbols of the supporters of the pre-revolutionary order dating back to the time of the French Revolution, and in contrast to the name of the Red Guard detachment and then the Red Army. The first time the name White Guard was used in Russia for Finnish police detachments created to fight the military coup, being financed by folks like J.P. Morgan and his buddies. A 4-month civil war followed, with Mannerheim successfully leading the white faction against the pro-Bolshevik Reds. He served briefly as the new state regent, chaired Finland's defense council, and then he retired. As the Soviet army was trying to enter Finland at 72 years of age, Mannerheim came out of retirement. Mannerheim recognized that he would have to wage 2 wars. He had no choice but to deploy most of the regular army, 6 of its 9 small divisions, along the southern frontier opposite Leningrad. That front ran 90 miles along the Karelian Isthmus that bridged the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Along this front, he constructed an interlocking system of tank traps, trenches, machine gun nests, and armored bunkers that became known as the Mannerheim Line. While high-intensity combat ranged along the isthmus, up north, Mannerheim had to conduct a very different kind of war. With nearly 600 miles of border and nowhere near enough regular divisions to cover it, he had to rely on the Home Guard as the backbone of his defense. This was nothing like the National Guard. Most of these men had served in the Great War, and some had hung onto the rifles to use for hunting. Most never partook of any military drills or training after the last shot was fired on November 11, 1918. There were also all the soldiers who were trained for their compulsory military time and then went home. When there are barbarians at the gate, you do what you have to do, or they'll kill you. Simo Hayah. I'll bet I'm not pronouncing that right. I have listeners in Finland. I hope I'm not upsetting y'all too much. His name is spelled H, A with 2 dots over it, a Y, H, and A with 2 more dots. I have enough trouble with English. I can barely speak Spanish. I have no idea how to pronounce his name. Simo Hayah is what I'm going to try and go with. Was born on December 17th, 1905 on a farm in Rutjarvi province of southern Karelia. Yep, that's another word I'm probably butchering. Which would later see some of the heaviest fighting of World War II and particularly partially become part of Russian territory. Growing up on a farm in the harsh Finnish wilderness made him hardy, hard-working, and patient. 1925, Hayah was drafted for a year of military service. He displayed his military prowess early on, and after 1 year had advanced to the rank of corporal. Later, Hayah joined the Finnish Civil Guard and discovered his talent and passion for shooting. He spent his free time practicing. Eventually, he could hit 16 targets per minute from 500 feet, making him ideal as a sniper in the war which was approaching. The idea of a sniper out there somewhere will prey on the nerves of invading soldiers. You and your buddies are moving along through enemy territory when suddenly one of the guys near you jerks back and hits the ground. The shot is heard after the body is down. The officers would do their best to try to get their troops back up and moving, but threats are not nearly as effective as actual death. Soviet officers soon developed a reputation for shooting their own men. I've known a few snipers over my time in both the Army and the Border Patrol. There's a lot more to it than just pulling a trigger. They have to be able to see and hit their target, so they have to know how to move around without being seen or heard. Camouflage is one of their strong points. Your eye will be attracted to movement. Snipers know how to move so slowly there is almost no movement to be seen. They have to be able to see their targets, so most use some very sophisticated scopes on their rifles. Well, Simo used an old-fashioned rifle with steel sights. No scope, no visual enhancing devices. Just what came mounted on the rifle when he got it. Seeing a target from a long way away is one thing. Sending a tiny bullet through the air with wind and distance causing the round to not go where you want it to go is another. In our tanks, we had laser rangefinders. The round had tracers built in. As the round went downrange, you could watch the tracer curve to the side and drop as it got close to the target. Wind was affecting a 105 millimeter round traveling at 5,170 feet per second. When we would pull the trigger, the barrel wasn't aimed at the target, it was aimed to the side. And the round would curve and drop as it hit the target right where we wanted it to. A sniper's bullet is smaller and therefore needs more windage or sight correction. You don't aim at where you're shooting, but you have to aim to the side and high, and there's all kinds of math involved. Hayah used methods that were almost superhuman. He would dress in white winter camouflage, and he would only carry 1 day's worth of supplies and ammunition, and he would set out to do his part for the winter war. Armed with his Mosin Nagant M91, a 7.62 rifle, he would pick a spot in the snow, and then he would sit there and kill any Russian soldier in his line of vision. He preferred using iron sights instead of scopes because the scope would glare in the sunshine and it would reveal his position. Sunlight will hit the lens of a scope and it'll make a flash. Even if only for a second, it would be enough to show the Soviets where he was hiding. Hayah would even put snow in his mouth so that his breath wouldn't be seen in the cold air. He would use snowbanks as padding for his rifle, and he would prevent the force of his shot from stirring up the snow. He did all of this in such a harsh terrain environment. The days were short, and when daylight was over, temperatures were down below freezing. Hayah could only work during daylight hours. He didn't have thermal or IR sights back then. A night vision had been developed way back in 1939, but it was crude and you needed a huge backpack to carry the batteries. Advanced technology is great until it stops working. Now then it's just a bunch of junk you have to carry around. The Soviets didn't move around much at night either. Any source of light was also a target. The Finnish army was not well equipped, but the one thing they had a lot of was the concept of sisu, S-I-S-U, which roughly translates to guts or determination. Hayah's skills were put to good use against overwhelming odds on many occasions. At one point, he and 31 other Finnish men faced off against 4,000 Soviet soldiers. That's 125 to 1. The thing to keep in mind is the bigger the units, the harder to move them around. A big mass of soldiers is also easy to spot. A small group of highly motivated soldiers can do a lot of damage in a short time. The Winter War only lasted 100 days. During this time, Hayah piled up the bodies. The numbers are something from 500 to 800 hits. He is still the world record sniper. In one day, Hayah managed to take down 40 Soviet troops. You've heard the old saying, one shot, one kill. This is precision shooting. In most battles, the guys on the front line do what's known as suppression firing. You just spray and pray 1 or 2 rounds will hit the enemy. In Vietnam, it is estimated it took 50,000 rounds fired to kill one enemy soldier. That's a lot of spraying and praying. The snipers over there, on the other hand, are said to have had more like 3 kills for every 4 rounds fired. This was using advanced equipment in much better conditions. There was no snowbanks and there were no sub-freezing weather. It didn't take long for the Soviets to find out their biggest deterrent to invading Finland was one man. They knew his name, but they began referring to Hayah as the White Death. As word of his accomplishments spread, the stories got bigger. Some soldiers have a tendency to enhance what they tell you. Some stories took on superhuman slant. The White Death was not human, but a spirit or a ghost. He could come and go without leaving footprints. He could see in the dark. You name it, they told it. The Finnish military began referring to him as the magic shooter. Everybody wanted to either be him or at least be able to say they knew him. If you saw the movie Enemy at the Gate with Judd Law and Ed Harris, a mostly fictionalized story of Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper who went up against Major Erwin Koenig, a German sniper. To begin with, there is no record of any German sniper named Koenig. Also, snipers were not high-ranking soldiers. The high-ranking soldiers were placed in positions of authority, and they weren't sent out into the field to take out one man. Vasily claimed that Koenig had 400 confirmed kills. Well, Germany says nay, nay. Hollywood can take any story and screw it up totally. The Soviet command wanted to end this reign of terror, so they began sending out their own snipers. A reward was placed on Hayah's head. In March 1940, a major firefight took place between the Finnish and the Soviet armies. In order to do your job, a sniper has to see the target. You need to be able to look from your place of concealment, so the part of you exposed is your face. During the battle, Hayah was struck in the jaw by an exploding bullet from a counter-sniper. The round took off almost half of his face, along with some of his jaw. When his body was found, none of the Soviets knew who he was, and so his body was just thrown into a pile along with all the other dead soldiers. The Finnish High Command wanted Hayah's body. If nothing else, they would see to a military funeral with all honors. The soldiers, small groups, were sent out to search for what was left of the sniper. In one of the piles of dead, they noticed movement. There is some movement after death, but this looked odd to them. They dug the body out, intent on taking it back to their encampment. Someone noticed that Hayah was still breathing. The rescuers said he was covered in blood, he was missing half his face, and part of his jaw. They took Hayah back to their encampment and sent him off for medical treatment. Things were not looking good, and the sniper was in a coma for 11 days. Rumors of Hayah's death spread around in Finland and the Soviet Union. He regained consciousness on March 13th, the day peace was declared between Russia and what was left of Finland. He read about his own death in a newspaper, and he sent a letter to the paper to correct the misunderstanding. Hayah then spent 14 months recovering from his wounds, and he had to endure 26 surgeries. After he had recovered, Hayah wanted to serve in the Continuation War from 1941 to 44. He was excused due to the severity of his facial injuries. Have you ever heard the expression, "The enemies of my enemies are my allies"? The Soviet Union had successfully invaded part of Finland. After the Treaty of Moscow, the plan for a Nordic Defense Union was resumed. Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden all said they should stick together to defend against invasion, especially from the Soviets. But they never got around to signing anything. In December 1940, Finnish President Kallio resigned and Ryti was elected in his place. When the tension between Germany and the Soviet Union grew in the spring of 1941, Finland approached Germany, but they didn't actually conclude any formal agreement. Nevertheless, Finland, like Sweden, after Norway capitulated, allowing the transit of German troops through their country. Even with all the spies running around looking for signs of invasion, the Soviets were caught with their pants, they were caught off guard. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 22, 1941, German troops were already on Finnish territory, and Finland was ready for war once again. Their submarines were already operating in the Soviet waters. The War of Continuation began with a successful Finnish offensive that led to the capture of large areas of eastern Karelia. Some Finns were reluctant to cross the old border in 1939, and the spirit of the Winter War had united the Finns had begun to weaken. Finland fought on the German side. They called themselves co-belligerents instead of allies. The country refused to deport, prosecute, or even discriminate against its Jewish population. Finland behaved humanely towards Jewish prisoners of war. There was no Jewish population in Finland before 1809, when it became a part of the Russian Empire. In 1827, Tsar Nicholas I issued an edict requiring Jewish boys from the age of 12, who were becoming known as cantonists, to undertake 25 years of compulsory military service. They were known as cantonists, conscripts in the Russian Empire. From then on, they were educated in special canton schools for future military service. The main aim of this edict, abolished in 1856, was to assimilate and eventually convert Jews to Christianity. The soldiers who completed their military service were allowed to live anywhere in the Russian Empire, and many decided to remain in the last place where they had been stationed. Hence, some Jewish soldiers settled in Finland. Since there were no Jewish brides to be found, the former cantonists would ask matchmakers from the Pale of Settlement, that's a territory within the borders of Tsarist Russia, where the residence of Jews was legally authorized, to help them find wives. Matchmaking is an ancient tradition central to Jewish culture. Instead of hanging out at a bar looking for your next ex-wife, you would go ask the matchmaker to find you a wife. The matchmaker would choose a female and send her to the young guy looking for love. Intermixing was considered a no-no. I can see a strong motivation to give the matchmaker a lot of cash so she didn't hook you up with someone undesirable. There was no rail system to transport people to Finland, so any prospective wives would be transported by cart. When former Cantonists were asked, "How did you meet your wife?" They would reply, "I got her from a cart." This was the beginning of the Finnish Jewish community. Mail-order brides without the internet. I am so glad I met my wife at college. She was a student teacher and I was in need of a Spanish tutor. Jewish soldiers fought in the Finnish ranks as equals, thereby inevitably helping the Nazis achieve some of their war aims. War makes for some strange stories. In the first days of World War II, the Jews living in Palestine would cheer any time they heard Germany was kicking the British backsides. Britain was in charge of Palestine, and the Jews didn't much care for the way they were treated. It wasn't until word came about the ghettos and the death camps that Palestine changed their ideas. They stopped cheering for Adolf and started cheering for Winston. I may have gotten a bit sidetracked. I do this a lot. That's why I use notes to stay on subject. Otherwise, I'd be talking about aliens pretending to be ghosts to mess with people's minds by now. Shortly after the Winter War, August 28, 1940, the Finnish Field Marshal Mannerheim promoted Hayah straight from Alakersantti, or Undersergeant, which is corporal to us. He promoted him from corporal straight to second lieutenant. From the winter of 1942 and 43, Germany's defeats began to give rise to growing demands for peace in Finland. After the breakthrough of the Russian army on the Karelian Isthmus in June 1944, President Raitai resigned on August 1st. He was succeeded by Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, who began negotiating for an armistice. This was signed on September 19, 1944, on condition that Finland recognized the Treaty of Moscow from 1940, that all foreign forces were to be evacuated. A pledge was given to cede Petsamo to lease an area near Porkkala, the southwest of Helsinki, and for a period of 50 years. Also, within 6 years, they had to pay the equivalent of $300 million in goods for war reparations. The Soviets invade Finland, and then they demand they pay reparations. Meanwhile, the German army refused to leave the country, and in a series of clashes that followed, it devastated great areas of northern Finland as it retreated. The final peace treaty signed in Paris on February 10, 1947, reiterated the conditions of the armistice agreement. Hayah was awarded the First and Second Class Medal of Liberty, as well as the Third and Fourth Class Crosses of Liberty. These later two were normally granted to only commissioned officers. As an additional honor, he received a name-plated Soko M2830 honorary rifle, donated by Eugene Johansson, a Swedish businessman and supporter of Finland. The rifle was later donated to the Karelia Jaeger Battalion Heritage Room, from where it was transferred to the Finnish Military Museum collection after the dissolution of the North Karelia Brigade in 2013. It took several years for Hayah to recuperate from his wounds, which required lengthy treatment and several surgeries. Although his face remained disfigured for the rest of his life, he otherwise made a full recovery, and after World War II, he was given a farm in Valkjärvi, a small municipality located in southeastern Finland, near the Russian border. I wonder what the Russians thought of having the White Death just right over there. He became a successful moose hunter and a dog breeder. He even would go on hunting trips with the president of Finland, Urho Kekkonen. Some people did not approve of his actions during the Winter War. People who spent the war hiding in some underground bunker, or better yet, in some other country. Hayah was met with hatred and even received death threats from these people. He was a well-known man and easy to recognize. Now, the injuries he sustained in the war left recognizable facial scars, so he tended to avoid large groups of people. He said he enjoyed working, but he began suffering from loneliness and fear. Nights were especially difficult for him. I guess today we would call that PTSD, but they didn't have a name for it back then. He had friends, and he also spent time at his parents' and his siblings' homes after the war. Hayah was known as a modest man who never boasted of his wartime merits. He rarely spoke of the war or his experiences. He was asked in 1998 how he had become such a good sniper. Practice, he said. In an Independence Day interview with Helsinki Sanomat in December 2001, shortly before his 96th birthday, Hayah opened up about his war experiences. He was asked if he felt remorse for having killed so many people. He replied, "I did what I was told to do, and as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone else had done the same." Hayah spent his last years in a war veterans nursing home in Hamina, where he died on 2002 at the age of 96. He was buried in his hometown of Ruokolahti, Ruokolahti. There, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. He never married, and he had no children. It is way too common for those who never have to fight to come out with condemnation of those who did. This happens in war that those who never experience it have no voice in the matter. The extraordinary heroes who did extraordinary things are usually just people who did what they had to do. For others to try putting them down, well, that's just wrong. I ran out of information before I ran out of time while talking about Simo Hayah. I don't like doing short shows. I only did a short show once when I interviewed Jeff Crypto Hulk Stewart because we had such a bad phone line connection. It took 15 minutes of the show just to connect with him. Anyway, I don't like doing short shows, so I'm going to add a little something about a man I knew many years ago. A man named Arnold Roth, who was a friend of my dad. He was a few years older, and they worked together as bricklayers. Arnold would come to our house, and he would tell some wild stories from time to time when he was in a B-17 bomber. Maybe he wasn't a hero to some, but to me, he was more than that. He was trained as the radio operator. During training, he asked if they would receive parachute training. He was told not to worry about it. When the time came, they would either get it right or else. His position in the plane was just behind the bomb section. There was a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the roof for him to help defend the aircraft. They set out from England one day to bomb Germany. The flight in was bad, but the return got worse. Their plane was riddled with German bullets. They lost 2 engines, and the rest of the air wing kept going, leaving them behind to fend for themselves. This was policy. You either kept up with the group, or you didn't. The captain told the crew to lighten the load, which meant get rid of anything not needed to keep the plane in the air. The crew got busy throwing everything overboard, which included their machine guns and all the ammunition. The plane was not going to make it, so the captain announced abandon ship. Well, actually he yelled bail out. The entire crew dropped what they were doing and jumped. Arnold was about to destroy the radio when he was told to contact the flight leader and tell him they were bailing out. Arnold had already burned the code book, so he just said over the air, "We're going down, crew bailing out." He destroyed the radio and ran for the exit. As he looked out the door, he didn't see any of his companions. They had all gone out already. He looked down, and all he could see were clouds. It was icy cold as he jumped. He had been told to count to 10 before pulling the ripcord. He said it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, pull. The reason for this was it was so cold up there, they would freeze to death before getting to the ground. The chute opened, and he drifted down to the ground. Down below, German soldiers were scrambling, trying to catch him. It was a benefit to them to catch an American bomber crew. They would get points for it. Also, the Luftwaffe were scrambling to catch him as well. The Luftwaffe had a policy of taking care of any enemy shot down over occupied territory. They figured if they took good care of them, hopefully the Allies would do the same for their men. I read about this in the book, A Higher Calling, about Franz Stiegler, a German fighter ace, and Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old American pilot who was on board Ye Old Pub. On December 20th, 1943, following a bombing mission over Germany, the severely damaged American craft was approached by Stiegler while attempting to fly to England from Berlin. Stiegler couldn't find it in himself to shoot at such a messed up plane. He was devastated. He was amazed that the plane was still in the air. He said that when he flew up behind it, he could see straight through the plane almost to the bomb section. He was so amazed that he flew up alongside the plane, and he just sat there looking at it with his jaw hanging open. Now, all the men on board Ye Old Pub, they were all trying to shoot at Stiegler, but their machine guns had frozen up because of the cold. Anyway, instead of shooting down Ye Old Pub, Stiegler accompanied them to the coast so that none of the other German planes would shoot at him. He was worried for the next week that somebody had taken down his tail number and he was going to get reported to the Scapo for not doing his job. But anyway, Stiegler survived the war, and so did Charlie Brown. You should read that book, A Higher Calling. Anyway, back to Arnold's story. As you see, I get sidetracked easily. Now back to Arnold's story. Once on the ground, he had no idea what to do. The French resistant fighters found him and they hid him in a barn. He was snuck from farm to farm, usually late at night, hidden in a hay wagon. Everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero. Folks would bring him food and wine, even though they didn't have enough for themselves. The whole coast was awash in German troops, so they smuggled him out by way of Turkey. It's a long way to Turkey by hay wagon. Once in Turkey, the resistance fighters turned him over to the Allies. Arnold was debriefed and put on a ship for home. He was to get 2 weeks off for surviving a bailout. Well, it took 6 days to get home. Once there, he knocked on his door. His wife opened the door and passed out. As she had been told, he'd been shot down and killed. Nobody bothered to tell her he was still alive. Arnold had to convince her he was not a ghost. She finally decided that a ghost wouldn't still be talking to her for such a long time. After spending a few days at home, Arnold was ordered back to England. The war was not waiting for anyone. Back in England, he was assigned to a new crew. No one had any idea if any of his previous crew had made it or not. The new crew went over to bomb Germany some more. Once again, their plane got shot to pieces. Arnold was ordered to send the message once more. They were bailing out. He ran to the door, jumped, waited the requisite 10 count. Once on the ground, he was met this time by the Polish resistance fighters. These guys had a radio, and they could call for help. These resistant fighters contacted England, and they told them they had an American bomber crewman needing a ride home. Well, England wasn't too interested. They told the English that they also had a British bomber crewman in need of a ride back home. The British said they'd be right over. Here's the plan. The plan kind of sucked. A torpedo boat was going to enter a bay at precisely this time. It was going to circle the bay 3 times, passing the end of a pier each time. Arnold and his fellow crewmen were to get into the boat somehow, because the boat was not slowing down and it sure the heck wasn't stopping. If they did not get in the boat, they were to fend for themselves. On the day, at the time, they hid in the trees waiting for the boat. There it was, right on time, coming faster than any boat should be able to travel. Arnold said it was skipping over the waves, only hitting every 3rd one. It passed the end of the pier and began making a huge circle. They timed it to see when it would be at the end of the pier again. Suddenly, every German soldier in the area began shooting at the boat. There were rifles, machine guns, artillery, and howitzers from all sides, including right behind where the 2 were hiding. Him and the British guy jumped to their feet and began running. Arnold said he heard a weird thud sound right next to him. He looked and saw that a howitzer round had taken the British guy's head clean off. The body kept going for a few steps before collapsing. This motivated Arnold to run even faster. As he was coming to the end of the pier, he saw the boat was not even close. He figured he was going to hit the water and then get run over for his troubles. Not wanting to be shot, Arnold kept running right off the end of the pier. As he fell, the boat flew up under him and he landed on the deck. A sailor grabbed him and held on to him and held him in place as the boat turned and made tracks for England. Once more, Arnold was given 2 weeks off for surviving being shot down. They put him on a ship bound for home. 6 days later, he knocked on his door and was met by his wife, who once more had been told he was dead, but had never been told he was still alive. Talk about repeating history. Orders came, and it was back to England. A new bomber crew was there for him. There was no word of any of the other crewmen from the second plane. This time, they were ordered to go on a nighttime raid. A big raid deep in Germany. Arnold said there were so many bombs exploding around them it was almost daylight outside the plane. Flares and searchlights were everywhere. They delivered their load and turned for England when the plane took a hit. The pilots did their best to get close to the channel, but the plane was not going to make it. The pilot announced, "Bail out." Arnold sent the message, crew bailing out, destroyed the code book, destroyed the radio, and then ran for the door. When he got to the exit, he looked out at nothing but blackness. He had no idea how high they were or how close to the ground they were. He jumped and immediately pulled the ripcord, figuring it was better to freeze to death than impact the ground. The chute opened, and he drifted down. He got caught up in a huge pine tree. It was so black Arnold couldn't see his own hand, let alone the ground below. All he could do was hang there and hope the sun would come up before the Germans found him. It was cold and it was dark. By morning, Arnold discovered he was only a few feet up. He cut himself loose and dropped to the ground, and then he went looking for the resistance fighters. They should be around here somewhere. It was December 16th, 1944. Arnold had no idea of the significance of that date. A few people did. The Battle of the Bulge, also known as the Ardennes Offensive, was a major German offensive campaign on the Western Front during World War II, which took place from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. It was launched through the densely forested Ardennes region between Belgium and Luxembourg towards the end of the war in Europe. Arnold had come down right in the middle of it. He couldn't find anybody to help him, so he set off hoping to find the American lines, which he should figure were to the west. All he had to do was navigate anytime he could see the sun. He walked and he walked until he could hear all kinds of shooting coming from all around him. Arnold was able to find the American lines. All he needed to do was sneak in late at night, identify himself. After sundown, he crawled across the field until he could hear voices. He identified himself as an American bomber crewman, and he asked to be let in. One of the sentries said, "What's the password?" In a lead-up to the offensive, the German High Command had rounded up every German soldier who could speak English. They had them trained in a secret camp for a few weeks to see who was going to make the cut. They had American uniforms and equipment. They were issued everything from the American soldiers that had been captured. They had to act like U.S. soldiers, and they had to convince everybody they were legit. The Germans that didn't quite make the cut were told they were being selected for a secret mission to be dropped behind enemy lines in order to kill Eisenhower. As the American troops pushed into France and Belgium, they began capturing a lot of German troops who, some of them, had been told about this secret mission. During questioning, they told the Americans they were to be dropped behind the lines to kill Eisenhower, and the Americans went nuts. English-speaking German soldiers, what can we do? Immediately, every company came up with all kinds of passwords and secret signs to prove they were real Americans. A lot of this had to do with baseball, since the U.S. at the time was the only place where baseball was played. Anyone who didn't know the password was shot. In actuality, the English-speaking German troops were to sow confusion and save any bridges and crossings for the oncoming Tiger tanks. If you saw the movie The Battle of the Bulge, you'll know what I was talking about. Well, Arnold didn't want to be shot, especially by his own side, so he snuck back into the woods. Cold and hungry, after a few days, he decided he was going to surrender to the Germans. What's the worst could happen? Spend a few months in a POW camp? So he crawled through the fields towards the German lines. At Malmedy, Belgium, December 17th, 1944, German troops of the 1st SS Leibstandarte, also Adolf Hitler Division, captured 113 American soldiers. Instead of treating them like prisoners of war, they shot them. Arnold found out the Germans were shooting prisoners. Great. The Americans had threatened to shoot him. The Germans weren't taking prisoners. He was stuck in the middle with nowhere to go. For the next week, Arnold did his best to stay away from anybody with a gun and to stay alive. In near exhaustion, he found himself near some soldiers. They were speaking English, but it sounded funny. Not American English, but not English English. He snuck in close to the lines and he asked, if he were to surrender, would they shoot him? Well, these soldiers were Canadian. They allowed Arnold to come in and give himself up, but they couldn't just let him wander around not knowing who he was, so they turned him over to another company, who in turn turned him over to another company. Soon, Arnold found himself in a POW camp, only this one was full of Germans. Arnold didn't speak German. He looked German, being first generation born in the U.S., so he found himself being scrutinized by all these German prisoners who all knew he was not one of theirs. The German soldiers were debating whether they should kill him or not, but they figured they'd better not or they might get in trouble. Arnold was allowed to live, just in case. After spending 2 weeks as a prisoner, his base second-in-command had to come and rescue him. This, I believe he was a captain or a lieutenant colonel, had to drive to this POW camp, and he had to say, yeah, that guy right there, he's one of ours. At home, his wife had been told he was dead, but they hadn't bothered to tell her he was still alive. He showed up, knocked on the door. She accepted the fact that he had almost been killed 3 times, but somehow managed to make it. After his 2 weeks off, he was back in England once more, this time mostly just finishing out his time in service. During this time, he asked and he searched for any word of the 3 bomber crews he had belonged to. No one had any word on any of these men ever surviving or being found. There was no record of any German POW camps holding any one of them. 24 American crewmen vanished from the air, never to be found or laid to rest. Now this story may be true. Arnold told it several times, and each time it got a lot more interesting. He embellished it a lot. After all he had gone through, I figured he deserves a bit of publicity. What makes him a hero? He could have said enough after being shot down and taken a less risky job. That was policy. Get shot out of the sky, stay out of the sky. He went back not once, but twice. That's hero work. At the end of the war, Arnold discovered he now had 4 serial numbers. Each time he got shot down and survived, he was simply assigned a new number instead of resurrecting the old one. This wasn't really a problem until he tried to retire. He had to go through all kinds of paperwork to explain why he had 4 serial numbers, which later became Social Security numbers as well. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell everybody. Get up on the roof of your house and yell at your neighbors. You should... never mind. That'll just piss people off. Tell folks that they should be listening if you think of it. Don't forget, if you like to show people what you listen to, you can buy a t-shirt or a coffee cup or a book at tpublic.com. Or if you'd like to buy one of my many books, you can find me on Amazon. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? The same murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?